Lesson 17 project. The king asks the queen to do some research on unicorns. The queen discovers that a unicorn's tail can tell them a lot about the unicorn. Primarily, it can be used to determine how old the unicorn is. The length of the tail is used to approximate its age. In order to measure the length of the tail of a unicorn, one must either tame the unicorn and have a very long tape measure, or use mathematics to determine its length. The queen is relatively certain that mathematics will provide the safest solution and indeed found a formula to do just that. In this project, you'll help the queen to determine the length of the unicorn's tail using a formula involving radicals. The formula s equals 2 pi times the square root of L divided by 32 can be used to express the time s in seconds it takes for a unicorn to swing its tail back and forth if the length of its tail L is expressed in feet. Not wanting to get too close to the unicorn, Queen Margaret determines that the unicorn swings its tail back and forth in a matter of 10 seconds. What is the first step the queen should take in order to solve this equation? So we have that it takes 10 seconds and we have an equation. So our first step is that the queen should substitute substitute 10 in for s in the equation. That is the first step. Refer to the previous question. Complete the step you indicated in the previous question. If necessary, use pi is about 3.14 in your calculations. What is the next step that Queen Margaret should complete? Well, remember on our last slide we said the first step is to substitute 10 in for s. So let's go ahead and rewrite. So instead of s we got 10 equals 2 pi times the square root of L divided by 32. What's our next step? Well, our next step is we want to get our radical by itself. So the next step that she would do would be to divide by 2 pi. That would be our next step. So her next step would be divide by 2 pi. That would be the next step that the queen should take. Refer to the previous question. Complete the step you indicated in the previous equation. If necessary, use pi is about 3.14 in your calculations. What is the next step that Queen Margaret should complete? So we had 10 equals 2 pi times the square root of L divided by 32, and we should be dividing by 2 pi on both sides. So that means that then we have 10 divided by 2 pi equals the square root of L over 32. So the next thing we can do is we're going to take and divide 10 divided by 2 times pi. Now remember that you need to put parentheses around that in order to type that in properly, and that instead of pi you can type in 3.14. So we end up getting 1.59235668. Try to keep as many of the decimals as you can in your equation. Okay? So that is completing our previous step. So now what would her next step be? Well, we have that this is a radical of a square root. So in order to get rid of the square root, we need to square both sides. So her next step would be to square both sides. Refer to the previous questions. Finish solving the equation. What is the length of the unicorn's tail in feet? Round to 1 decimal place. So if we look back, the next thing we need to do is we need to square. So I'm going to go ahead and square it, and then I'm going to end up with whatever I get squared equals L divided by 32. So whatever I get when I square that number is going to equal L divided by 32. So I'm going to go ahead and square my number. If you need to get out a calculator, which you should have out in order to do this, go ahead and do that. So when I square it, I end up with a 2.5355998. So now I want L by itself. So L is being divided by 32. So in order to get rid of that division by 32, I need to multiply both sides by 32. So I'm going to multiply what I had as my answer times 32. So I end up with 81.13919 equals L. And if I look here, it says round to 1 decimal place. So I'm going to take my decimal here, go to the right, my first decimal place, look at the number after it, and see, well, if it's a 3 doesn't make it round up. Only if it's a 5 or higher would I have rounded the 1 up to a 2. So that means I'm going to leave it as 81.1, and then the units would be feet. So the unicorn's tail is about 81.1 feet long. Hope that this helps with your Project 17 lesson. Lesson 17 project. If you have more questions, feel free to ask.